Okay, so let's restart. So the first thing that we are going to do is to talk about. So remember, we started out by saying that we're going to be doing systems which process digital information, and first aspect of that is how can we represent information in these digital systems? What goes on? Can we represent arbitrary type of things, arbitrary type of information in some digital format? And a lot of it is intuitive. You have already encountered it, but we're going to do it in a little bit more formal fashion. So how do we go around representing things? Uh, excuse me. Okay. It corresponds to chapter one. Okay. So so what's going on in so systems is a generic engineering term referring to, like I said, sort of a box which takes some inputs, takes some out, produces some outputs, and what we are interested in are systems which are taking information of some form in, signals of some form in, and producing, processing them, or doing something with them, communicating them to some distant place, and then producing an output for that. So, for example, yeah, something could take, let's say, um, sound waves in, spits out the text which was in any speech in those sound waves. Okay, so that's an example of a system, and that's actually an example of a system which we have information coming in as a waveform of the sound and information going out as some sort of representation of the text that we send. So like, for example, Siri is conceptually a system like that, right? I mean, Siri running on a smartphone plus the cloud is something that's taking my sound waves in, and it's then creating some sort of a representation of it, which then feeds into their Q&A system, for example. So, the system itself then processes the signals which came in, the input which came in different ways, analyzes it, perhaps sends it elsewhere, all sort of things that may happen. The signals themselves in general engineering system could be in a variety of forms. They could be chemical signal, electrical signal, or biological, some sort of other form of physical variable that you might imagine, pressure waves, things like that. And you can actually imagine even building computers which are working on, let's say, chemical signals and all. People do, but our computers tend to operate electrically. So much of what we think of as digital systems is usually in context of electronics, but doesn't have to be. Photonics has a very important role in high-speed systems, and as I mentioned, other physical things could also be used as digital as systems. So so that's the systems. What we are specifically interested in are systems where input and output is excuse me, is discrete valued. And by discrete valued, what I mean is just literally when you sort of first encounter these things, that instead of a continuous real valued thing, kind of a smoothly changing waveform, for example, these are values which are drawn from a set. Okay, so input and output are both discrete in that regard. So, for example, if I'm worried about, let's say, status of a door, door can be open, door can be closed, two values, discrete, it's a finite, enumerable set of values that exist. Okay. Um, um, for other things, you might imagine sort of other similar things. So almost any thing that generally we encounter in real life, you can think of it as it taking a set of values. Even things which may be humongously large, like for example, set of integers that can be represented by the int data type in C++. Well, the int data type in C++, if you're running on a 32-bit computer, takes 2 to the power 32 values. It's a finite set. So anything practical that you're going to encounter certainly falls into the category that it's discrete and it's finite and discrete. And if it's not, we can convert it that way. So like, for example, let's go back to my example of sound wave and hitting the microphone of my smartphone. In that case, we convert it into discrete values. And there are many ways you can imagine converting real numbers into discrete numbers. The simplest one being, I kind of think of intervals. And if the value lies in an interval, then I give that interval an ID of some form. So I basically, let's say if I were to take numbers which can be real valued between 0 and 10, I can chop it up into 10 bins and call numbers which are between, let's say, 0 and 1 as 0, between 1 and 2 as 1, and so on and so forth. I can just create some intervals to do that. So information, generally speaking, that we encounter in real world is either already discrete, as in the examples out here, or intuitively, at least, we can map it to some set of discrete values at, of course, some loss of precision. But by having sufficiently large number of bins, I can be arbitrarily accurate. So, music industry back in before you guys were born, 80s and all, music used to be in those vinyl records. Right, and that was continuous values, the grooves in the vinyl. And then CDs came along, and the sound waves, the music was represented digitally, and there were a lot of people who basically said, "Oh, this is the end of music. We are losing precision because what was essentially infinite precision, real value thing. Suddenly, we are representing it using a finite number of values." Okay, in case of the CDs, I think it's 14 bits or something like that, or how so many bits they use for presenting that. Okay, the point is that anytime we map things into discrete values, we are going to have to use a finite number. But just like what happened there, the number of bits was sufficient enough that for human ears to differentiate a 1-bit change was impossible, because our ears have only finite sensitivity, limited sensitivity. So we love the pristine quality of digital music, and all those fears never came to pass. And I think in industry after industry, we are seeing things which were analog, real values, infinite set of values that they can take, they get digitized and handled by computers, and essentially we tend to be better off. The reason we tend to be better off, as we see a little bit later, is that when you have signals in an analog form, they are subject to noise and perturbations which are very hard to control. When they are in digital form, then we can have much more repeatable, replicable ways of representing things. So it's a much cleaner system, and we can do a lot more sophisticated stuff with it. So digital representation is not as limiting as one might think. So discrete valued and is what makes a system digital. It still doesn't have to be electrical. There is nothing about the story that I told you says anything about this being an electronic computer. Okay, in fact, the first digital computer, as many of you may have read in popular press and all, was actually goes all the way back to mechanical machines built in like 1600s or so. Charles Babbage and all made the very first digital computer using gears, mechanical gears with finite number of teeth, and therefore a mechanical system which could take a finite number of values, finite number of possible configurations, and that was the very first digital computer. So doesn't have to be electronic, could take any physical form. A very special case of digital is the extreme case of being binary, 0 and 1. Of course, that's not the only possible value thing. I mean, humanity has dealt with 10 things, base 10 numbers for the longest while, and other societies like Babylonians had base 60. I think some of the American Indian tribes and all have had other bases. There have been other base 24 has been around in some societies. So there have been other bases, but base 10 dominated. But base 2, namely binary, the extreme case is extremely simple. There is two possibilities. You cannot go wrong. If I have a system, it's either left or whatever. State 0, state 1, true, false. So very, very easy to reason about that. So that's bits, but binary doesn't mean that it has to be bit 0 and bit 1. It's only referring to the fact that there are two possibilities, open, close, true, false, 0, 1. They are all binary. So the nice thing is that it's easy to design systems, physical systems which are binary. So a switch being on or off, mechanical relay being on or off. There are plenty of examples of designing things which can be very easily spin of an atomic particle being up or down, okay, electron being there or not being there, transistor being on or off. So the attraction behind binary systems is they are easy to represent, easy to design, and they are very robust. Because imagine, let's say, for example, I was trying to represent signals using voltage, which electronic systems do. And let's say my voltage value can range from 0 to 5. If I were to represent two values using this, let's say a binary system, then I can basically say something like, values which are close to 0 represent a 0, close to 5 represent a 1. Versus, let's say, in the same span of 5 volt, I want to represent, let's say, 10 value decimal system. So then I would basically say, okay, values which go from 0 to 0.5 represent the number 0. Those which go from 0.5 volt to 1 volt represent the number 1, and so on and so forth. So I have 10 intervals created. Now, the former is more robust than the latter. Why?
You have noise and signal.
Yeah, so, and what is noise? What does noise?
The background voltage.
Yeah, so let's say there's some perturbation happens in voltage. Maybe I was running the system at my home and a washer, dryer, microwave, something came on, some voltage glitches happened, noise came in. So noise is going to affect the voltage value, and therefore is going to affect the value that I think the signal is representing. For the first case, where I was representing 0 and 1, they were quite far apart. So the noise will have to be quite large for me to make a mistake. Because quite likely what I'll do in that system is that if I see a voltage, I'll say if it's below 2.5, it's a 0. If it's higher than 2.5, it's a 1. So I have a margin of 2.5 volt. My start out with 0, and there could be an error of 2.5, and I'll still think of it as a 0. Whereas in the latter system, where I divided things into 10 bits, I have a lot less margin for mistake, and therefore a lot less tolerance for noise. So binary systems are also good from that regard. Okay. So now once we decided discrete, and like I said, binary is good. So let's think about what else happens. So first challenge is we need to represent discrete values. So now if my underlying physical system is already discrete, then things are nice and easy. If I'm using a mechanical gear or something, it already has a discrete set of possibilities, and therefore representing discrete values is not a problem. But if my underlying system is not discrete, then I have to play some game along the line of what I described. So for example, if I had an electronic system, there is nothing in electronic systems which says that the voltages are discrete. The voltage is a continuous quantity. Or for example, pressure of sound waves, these are intrinsically analog quantities, intrinsically continuous. Somehow we need to map our discrete sets of values onto those underlying analog, underlying continuous things. And the way we have to do it is by playing that game of creating bins and mapping things to it. So let's look at how it is done in electronic systems, but you can apply this thing to your other favorite physical quantity, whatever it may be. So usually in electronic systems, they operate between some minimum voltage, some maximum voltage. In this particular case, there is a Vmin, there is a Vmax that kind of represents the operational values that can exist. Above that, above Vmax, below Vmin, some sort of a damage will happen. So that kind of no man's land. You don't want to go there. And then, let's say I want to represent a binary system. I want to represent 0 and 1. So what is done is we designate some range of values to represent 0 and some range of voltages to represent a 1. So in this particular case, we are going to represent values from Vmin through VIL to represent 0, and therefore I call it V0. Is my cursor there? Yeah, okay. It's very hard for me to see the display up there, unfortunately. And then values from VIH to Vmax, we call them as 1, and we label them as V1. So I've created two ranges. One range corresponds to 0 values, the other range corresponds to 1 value. What this is saying is that if I monitor that voltage, and if it lies in the range Vmin to VIL, then I'm going to interpret it as representing the 0 value, or because I'm working with 0 and 1 binary values. And if it happens to lie between VIL and Vmax, then I'm going to think of it, interpret as the value 1. This is entirely an interpretation we are giving. We could have done it the other way around. We could have given the first one to be the value 1 and the second one to be value 0. As long as you are consistent in your interpretation, it's okay. You also see that there is this bit of a zone, no man's land in the middle. Why do you think, what role that might be playing? So I sort of parceled out my voltage range. In this case, it's from minus 0.3 volt to 2.8 volt in kind of these zones. So there are a couple of valid zones corresponding to 0 and 1, but in the middle there is this zone which I have a question mark.
Is it like a buffer? So that if you were in one zone and it's slightly like went over, it wouldn't like fluctuate between 0 and 1.
Exactly. So you are not going to fluctuate between 0 and 1 at that boundary. Basically, what you are calling as a buffer is kind of right term. You're basically creating this zone where if things go into that, I'll know that it's neither, it's an invalid value. So I'm basically giving myself some protection within that. Now, the way ideally a system would work is whenever it produces an output, if the output is 0, it should produce something close to Vmin, so that I have a lot of margin for that value to get corrupted and still be treated as 0. So imagine a system is I have a system which wants to output 0 in the scheme. If it were to output a value which is just a little bit below VIL, that is going to be problematic because then a tiny bit of noise can take it into that no man's land. So it's a good design for the system to output value for 0 to output a voltage which is close to Vmin, and for 1 to output a voltage which is close to Vmax, so that I have a large possible margin against noise or other forms of perturbation that a physical system inevitably has. So this is how I could encode a binary signal. In this particular case, it turns out it does correspond to something real, and I could always change the interpretation. I could use the same philosophy to design a base 4 system or some other system, right? I just need to create more intervals and provide more gaps, but the concept kind of holds true. The advantage with binary is super simple, on, off. That's just what we are dealing with. Any question on this one? So again, I can take physical quantities, which are analog, and I can interpret them digitally by creating these bins. But when we create these bins of values, ranges of values, some values are impossible because the physical system will get damaged. And then we define these intervals, and then we leave some gap between the intervals so that we are tolerant to noise. And also, we make the bands themselves to be wide enough so that, again, we are tolerant to variations that may happen. There are many reasons. So besides noise, there is another reason that we give these kind of bands and all is that it's very hard to create physical systems which are identical. What I mean by that is, let's say I'm creating a whole bunch of circuits like these. The problem is each copy of the circuit is going to be slightly different. The values of electronic components are going to be slightly different, and therefore the voltages are going to be slightly different. So if I were to design these systems and say that, only the value 5 volt corresponds to a 1, or only the value 0.5 volt corresponds to a 0, I'll have a problem because I will not be able to create copies of that system which exactly hit the 0.5 volts. I have to provide some band, some margin around these things to also take care of these variations. So noise and variations are two things. The other thing is physical systems age. So you create something, and then over time there are slight changes in the dimensions and chemical concentrations and whatnot, and therefore again what might be for some input when it currently is outputting 4.5 volt, a year later it may output 4.4 volt because the system ages. And believe it or not, electronic systems also age. The transistors, the silicon inside them, they undergo physical changes over time, and their values and performance and all changes over time, and therefore, and they eventually fail. So even though our electronic devices seem so robust and all, but actually internally all these things are going on there. Copies are not identical, they age over time, and of course they have noise. So all of these things means that mapping digital values onto analog values, one has to take all these factors into account also. Okay, so that's the first challenge, and the second challenge is that I'm designing a system where I have some input, some output, and those inputs and outputs take values from some set. Those values may not correspond to what my system is capable of representing. What I mean by that is the following. Let's say I have designed a system, electronic system, which can represent zeros and ones the way I showed. But now I want to write, so deep down it can represent two values, 0 and 1. But then any real system I'm going to design is going to take some inputs and some outputs which represent some sets of values. Maybe the input is an set of possible number of people in a room, for example, and the output is some other quantity related to that, like, for example, how many people are in different parts of the room. Okay, so there could be different types of inputs and outputs which are not necessarily binary, in the sense number of people in a room is not 0 or 1, it is some finite number, possibly up to the capacity of the room. So now again, easy case out here is if my input and output were themselves binary, in the sense as in could only take two values, because then I could designate one to be 0, the other to be 1, I'm done. But that would be extremely limiting. So again, I have to deal with the situation that while my internal system is capable of representing things in terms of zeros and ones, two values, the information I want to represent, the input to my system, output to my system, may not be two valued. It may take multiple values. So what can I do with that? Okay, how can I handle that? So the examples out here are, what if I want to represent number of colors, the color in which a car is available, or what if I want to represent the temperature on a thermostat, different temperatures it can represent, or the level of light, things like that. So again, there are two possibilities. The information I want to represent is discrete but not binary, and the other possibility is information I want to represent is continuous. And we already alluded to a little bit on how we can do the second case, namely I divide things into bins and then represent the bins. But let's talk about it a bit more formally. So let's take the case of how many, let's say a car is available in 100 colors. So what do I do now? My system only wants me to say 0 or 1, but I have 100 colors. I have 100 discrete values, but I can only represent 0 or 1. So this is where now you begin to think in terms of multiple bits. I cannot represent it using a single 0 or 1, but I can represent it as a collection of 0 or 1. So let's say this is the set of colors I have. I have 8 possible colors: white, red, blue, yellow, blah blah blah, and I have to represent it in this binary system. So the trick then is that we use multiple bits to represent it. So how many bits do I need for something like this? 3. So I have 8 possible values. If I have 3 bits, 2 times 2 times 2, they can represent 8 things. Okay. Now, as to which pattern, which combination of 3 bits corresponds to which color is really an arbitrary choice. Okay. I can assign 0, 0, 0 to white or to a different color. It's really kind of up to us. It doesn't really matter as to what choice you pick. So this is one possibility. Okay. If I were to give you n bits, then I can represent 2 to the power n possible choices using that, right? Each bit is capable of 2. If I give you m elements, if I were to say my information can take m possible values, how many bits do I need? Log 2, right? So log to the base 2 of n, ceiling of that. Okay. So that was the easier of the 2 cases. My information was discrete. I can work things out. And again, very important to note that the precise mapping is not important out here as long as you are consistent. So if I decide white means 0, 0, 0, then everywhere in my system I need to be consistent about it. Okay, I have to interpret it the same way. Now let's take the case of continuous information. So I have a thermostat which can take, well, actually this is, yeah. So which can take values from 68 to 82. And so then the first thing you'll have to do is temperature is continuous. But if I'm going to represent it digitally, I have to then divide it into bits. So basically I have to say, you know, what's the resolution to which I care about the temperature in this thing. Okay, so let's say the resolution I care about is 2 degrees. So that is my bin size. So I can go from 68 to 82 with a step size of 2. That's my the step size or quantization level that I'm going to be working with. So how can we represent that? So now what you do is after you have created the bins, in this case step size of 2, so I have 68, 70, 72, 74, all the way to 82. So I have 8 possibilities. And then again, I can map them into some values. So first I quantize to a finite set, that is the creating the bin. And then I give the values, in this case 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, and so on and so forth. So there are 2 things going on out here, right? First is I'm quantizing a continuous values into some discrete groupings. And the second thing is then I am giving each one of those group a bit pattern. How many bins, how many discrete groups you divide it into depends upon your application. For thermostat setting, perhaps 2 degrees sufficient. Okay, I mean, we are not very sensitive to smaller values of temperature differences. On the other hand, in some chemistry experiment, maybe I need something to a precision of 0.1 degree, in which case I will need more groupings. So how many groups you divide a continuous value into is really a function of what is the sensitivity, what's the accuracy with which, not accuracy, what's the precision with which you want to measure something, measure value. So it's going to be a function of that. What bit patterns you assign to it again is arbitrary as long as you are consistent, although it probably stands to reason that for something like temperature, I would like to give smaller values, a smaller binary representation, and build a higher temperature, a higher value, okay, so that I can do comparisons and all that more easily. But again, there is nothing set in stone about it. I could have chosen a different set of mappings of those 3-bit values corresponding to temperature as long as I am consistent about it. This process of going from continuous to discrete values is done using special circuits which are called as ADCs, or analog to digital converters, which take an analog signal, an analog voltage value, analog voltage signal or analog current signal, and then output a discrete number, which is again going to be represented using voltages, but now would be corresponding to zeros and ones using the scheme that, for example, I talked about earlier. So ADCs take continuous values represented as a physical variable and map them into discrete values represented using some same or some other type of a physical variable. Okay? And these systems are called A to D converters or ADCs, and they are extremely critical because this is how computers get to process real world information. Because nothing in the world is intrinsically bits. I mean, bits are, once you go beyond the mathematical concept, for me to represent bits physically, I need to have some physical representation, and then it has to be information about something useful, which usually is some physical world signal of some form. So information, as you can see then, even complicated information can always be somehow converted into bits, and those bits can be represented using voltages or some other type of physical signal. So, point to emphasize, point to remember also is that there are many different ways you can do these mappings, and there are different reasons why you might adopt different ones, and also there's nothing which says that I have to use the minimum number of bits also. So I have the same thermostat example out here with the same set of values of temperature, 68 through 82, but I have 3 different schemes shown out there. In one case, I'm using 3 bits. In another case, I'm using 7 bits. In another case, I'm using 8 bits. And they all represent different takes. The last one is kind of interesting enough that it is given a name. It's called one-hot coding or one-hot representation. So what you see out here is that I had 8 possible values. So in this representation, we use as many bits as the number of values I have. So if my set has 100 values, I'm going to use 100 bits. And then what we further do is that each value is represented by a pattern where there is a 1 in one position and 0 in all the other positions. So like 68 is represented by a 1 in the first bit, leftmost bit, and zeros elsewhere. 70 is represented with a 1 in the second bit, and so on and so forth. So this is called one-hot coding because only one bit is hot, as in is a 1, the rest are cold, as in the zeros. The middle scheme is another, also has some sort of pattern to it, but again, it's all about being consistent, and there are certain schemes which are more, which have become popular or have some good properties. So let's talk a little bit about that. Look at the first scheme. So firstly, if you look at these patterns 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, you can interpret them as a digital number, as a binary number, a base 2 number. So 0, 0, 0 in base 2 is 0. 0, 0, 1 in base 2 is 1. 0, 1, 0 in base 2 is what? 2, right? So, and 0, 1, 1 is 3, and so on and so forth. Okay? But I don't have to give that interpretation. The fact that that assemblage of bits I think of as a number with a value is, again, I choose to do it. Okay, so setting this aside for a moment, look at the first scheme, and can you tell me if that way of mapping is useful has some useful property, if any. Someone else. Okay, safe space is only 3 bits. It's a minimal. Okay, but there are many possible 3-bit schemes. I could have shuffled them, right? Does this particular mapping have a useful property?
Small to big.
Yeah, small temperature mapped to smaller binary values, bigger temperatures are mapped to bigger binary values. So what that means is, if I give you 2 temperatures in our binary representation, I can easily, hopefully, compare which one is larger than the other, right? At least as humans, we could do that, okay? Last scheme, do you think some merit to that? It's using a lot of bits, it's pretty wasteful.
I think it might be faster to detect the differences, like because you only have to check one, like there's only one bit difference, or like there's only one bit that that is changed in each.
Right. You're dancing around kind of the right answer. So, it's many a times I want to do something if it is 68 and something else if it is 82 and something else if it's 76. This has already decoded it for me, right? It has already, I can just look at that one bit to know whether it's 68 or not. I can look at different bit, presumably a different X or Y, for example, to say, oh, is it 76 or not? Okay, and so on and so forth. This is very useful in many systems where I need to control something. Like, for example, there may be some electromechanical relays, and when the temperature is 76, I want this relay to turn on because maybe it does something else. When temperature, or was it temperature? Yes, when temperature is something else, I want to do something different at that time. So I can just look at that one bit. So this one has that advantage, namely, I can easily know whether the value is something specific, okay? Which is why it's called, part of the reason of 1 hot is coming from that also. Can you think of some other advantage?
If you have multiple temperatures, like in a set, you can figure out which temperature are in the set.
Okay, so you can, excellent, I hadn't thought of that, but I can represent sets easily, right? I mean, I can represent sets of temperatures this way. Okay, so that's good. Can you think of some other?
It's easy to detect invalid values.
It's easier to detect invalid values. If some bit flips, I can, now of course it runs counter to this scheme in the sense I can either represent sets or worry about invalid values, but the point made out here is the following, that in this last scheme, if some bit flips, I will immediately end up with either all zeros, which is invalid, or I will end up with something which has 2 ones, which is also invalid. So if I have a 1 bit of error, it's easily detectable. Whereas in the first scheme, if a bit flips, it's still a valid pattern, and therefore I will not be able to detect it. So this last scheme is more robust in that regard. So all these different coding schemes have different merits. Okay, some are more space saving, some are easier to do arithmetic with, some are easier to do control with, some are easier to detect errors. There's no right or wrong answer. It always is relative to some goal that you have for the system you're designing. And also, one thing to bear in mind is that things that may be harder for us as humans may still be trivial for a digital circuit to do. So let's take the first scheme as example, and we said this particular way of assigning 3 bits is great because I can look at 2 binary values and say which represents the higher temperature. Because we as humans see it very easily that 101 is greater than 100. But for a digital circuit, even if there was some other jumbled up pattern, the comparison may not be much harder to do, or may even be easier to do. So oftentimes we kind of think, oftentimes the representation gets chosen because it's more human friendly. It's easier for us to understand it, and that's also very important. because ultimately at some stage information will be interpreted by humans. So now imagine for a moment that the first scheme, we had a display which was a binary display. It just displays the 3 bits, and some human operator has to interpret it. Then of course the particular one we have out here is a preferred one because it's easier to see which one is higher or lower than some other jumbled up configuration that we might have. So if humans are consuming this information, then it's easier, it's good to make representations which are easier to understand. I'm sure some of you may have seen those binary wall clocks and stuff like that, which basically are maddeningly hard to kind of understand time. So binary values tend to be hard on us anyway, but when it comes time to debug systems and all, it's good to keep your representations human friendly. Okay, so let's talk about things like how can I represent dates, playing cards, stuff like that. So let's look at a date. So let's say I want to represent number of days since January 1, 0000, which is a wrong date because there was no year 0, but let's imagine there was because the textbook says there was. So, so number of days since then, well, we can calculate how many days can exist since then, and then it turns out that 20. So I had made this slide 2 years ago, as you can see, but it doesn't change the number of dates. So that could be one representation. I can represent the date with respect to some absolute reference date. I could represent the date by decomposing it into month, day, and year. So I can say month, there are 12 months, so I need 4 bits for it. Days, well, in a month there could be as many as 31 days, so therefore 5 bits for that. And then finally a year, well, we are representing whatever, 20 something, so you can work it out. 11 bits suffice for that, so maybe we can use that. 11 bits will suffice until the year 2048. So I can use that, so that gives me again 20 bits. But arguably, so let's look at these 2 things. Days since January 1st, year 0, and month, day, year, both of them take 20 bits. Can you think of relative merits? What is easier to do or nice in the first scheme versus the second scheme?
The first scheme seems easier to compare which one's like the longer
Right.
way.
Which one is a later date, right? Whereas the second scheme would be harder. I'll have to do individual fields. Okay, great. What is easier in the second scheme?
If we wanted to see the information about the month or year, we could easily see the second.
Yeah, I mean something more easily human interpretable, right? I mean if I were to give you some value in the first scheme, I don't know which year you're in, right? So that's you can have month, day, year, day of week, in which case I have some redundant information, but then I can figure out day of week much more easily. Okay, so sometimes we keep additional information to make certain tasks easier. Okay, so for example, if I often have to figure out what day of the week it was it a weekend or not, then storing that information additionally is useful. And as you might imagine, again, those of you have done, hopefully most of you have done some software programming, the same story there also. When you design your classes or structures and all, what fields should be there, how should I represent information, all these kind of considerations come up there as well, same story. Playing card. I could represent it as an absolute number in a sorted deck of cards. I can represent it as a suit type and a number, so like 2 bits for suit and 4 values for the card within the suit. Again 6 bits. I can have a fully decoded suit, so 1 hot coded, and a 1 hot coded card number, 4 plus 13, 17 bits. Again, different trade-offs across these. I'll let you sort of ponder about this. The message I want to leave you away is there are many different ways of coding things. You have to select a way of coding or mapping information which is suitable for your task, what operations you expect to do on it, what are the trade-offs which are coming from it, because ultimately there is no right or wrong answer. It really, as I said earlier, goes it's respect to the requirements. Sometimes your hands are tied. You are designing a system which has to exchange information with another system. and therefore there will be external constraints that you have to represent things a certain way. Otherwise, things may not be understandable. For example, GPS. We all rely on it. GPS satellites send information out. Our receivers, GPS receivers, things built on the phone and all, receive it, spit out information about location and time and all. It's done in a very specified format so that every piece of software can understand. So likewise, there are standards which emerge for representing information, and abiding by them is what makes sort of applications and systems work smoothly across across each other. So how would you select a representation? Well, short answer then is look at your application, see what operations are needed, and then design your representation. Certain operations are going to be easy, certain operations are going to be hard, depending upon your choices. So this slide goes over the examples that from the day of the year examples, so like determining representation of tomorrow. When I was doing things as number of days since the year January 1, 2000, that's easy. I just increment the number. Determining if two days are in the same month was much harder there because I had to figure out what the month was, and so forth. Any given representation is going to have its weak and strong points, and you just have to think about it, how it works. Recalling this one back, so again, going back inside the system. So at this stage, we have figured out that if our system can represent zeros and ones, then I can represent all sort of information coming into the system, all sort of information coming out of the system. And then inside the system, I'm going to be dealing with these zeros and ones, and then I'm going to do my processing using them. And physically, zeros and ones are represented by taking some physical variable, such as voltage, and then assigning some range of values to 0, some range of values to 1, and taking into account these considerations of noise, variation, aging, all those kind of things that I mentioned, which make physical systems a little bit of a nuisance to deal with. Touching upon that point a little bit more, that why digital is good in that regard is that digital has the property that it removes the effect of noise. So let me explain that. Let's say I were to design systems which were non-digital, which were dealing with analog signals. So if one system added some noise, then the next system, which is using the output of the first system as its input, is going to see that noise. And that process builds up. So what happens is, in a pure non-digital system, noise builds up. And by the time you have a cascade of systems feeding into each other, you may end up with something which has a very high degree of noise. With digital, the advantage is that at every time we output, we can design our system such that it outputs a good value. So let me explain. Let's say I have a system which is taking a digital input, let's say a binary input, 0 or 1. That 0 or 1 coming to it is noisy. So by noisy I mean, instead of 0 being V min, it is some higher value. Or instead of 1 being V max, it is something lower than V max. But we can design this system that the output it makes is clean. So my system is the function f. It's getting a 0. So when it gets a 0, in any value in this range, it will think of it as a 0. So even if the voltage was, let's say, 0.6, it's a valid 0. It's fine, but it's noisy. Instead of being at minus 0.3, which is kind of a solid 0, I had some noise, so it was had begun to kind of drift upwards. But then when my system outputs a value, f of v1, whatever it is, it's a 0 or 1, it can output something clean. And then, so essentially, every time I operate on digital signals, I can remove the effect of noise that had built up at my inputs. I can output a pristine, clean 0 or 1, And this way, I have the self-correcting property or cleaning property. Whereas if I were designing a system which was entirely analog, then that noise will just keep adding up and up and up, and sooner or later it may swamp everything out. So digital has that property that every time we operate on it, we have a chance to clean things up, remove the effect of noise which was available at input, and that's a powerful feature of digital systems because they're a lot more robust as a consequence. Okay. Yeah, I think I've made these points again and again. So yeah, this is basically showing that how in case of non-digital systems, every time I have a noise, that noise adds up. So whereas in case of digital systems, every time I operate on a system, I remove the effect of the noise because the output can again be clean, be minimally. Okay, I think I'm going to stop out here. What we saw today then was that, ignore these last two slides. Okay, so what we basically saw is that digital interface of what are the issues that arise in representing information digitally, and the fact that you have to think about both these issues. How can complicated information be represented in bits, and how can bits themselves be represented through physical symbols, and kind of the issues that arise. So see you on Thursday.